Hello, we're back again and we're talking the sit-down relationships, and on this particular episode we're going to be talking about the politics of our blackness. We're going to be dissecting the dichotomy of blackness. It's going to be a tough conversation because we know that as Africans we're not a monolith. We're not one kind of blackness. There's different aspects of us. And we have none other than Jamil F, who is a critical diversity expert. Join me. 2021 marks 27 years of democracy in South Africa, and whilst there's so much work that has been done by political leaders, social activists, and ordinary citizens to challenge systems that were forced on us pre-1994, the sad reality is that the seeds of racial dynamics in this country still haunt us today. Jamil F is a Cape Town-born, Johannesburg-based critical diversity studies PhD candidate, researcher and author, and today he joins us on the sit-down relationships as we interrogate and unpack racial dynamics between the black and colored community in South Africa. We also look at the dichotomy of blackness globally and whether in all of this there's light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jamil.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're friends personally,
Yeah.
and then there's the work,
Yes.
right? And there's the advocacy work that we do. I always find it so intriguing, and I was just saying to you off camera that it's not necessarily intriguing, but I've come to learn to accept it. Your work on social media is very important because there's the old Richard that shows up on social media sometimes, and then you'll call me out on something. It's like, check yourself. And you'll check, it's kind of a check, whether public or even personally.
Yeah.
And then there's also the one where we go out and we drink and we party,
Yes.
and there's that side as well. What made you want to get into the expertise that you're in and the work that you do as a critical diversity studies?
It was an interesting journey for me because, quite frankly, growing up, I wouldn't say I was sheltered from reality, but I was. The neighborhood I grew up in and sort of the life that we had in that neighborhood was very segregated. So for the most part, for a big part of my life, I grew up around people only who were like me, who I could relate to, who had the same kind of cultural references that I had. So for me, that was the world, And I think what really sort of opened my world up was when I moved to Johannesburg, because a lot of this has also got to do with spatial arrangements. You actually, especially when you're much younger, when you get older, there's a kind of responsibility that falls on you to actually go and explore the world and open your mind. But when you're younger, it's very easy to accept that this is just how the world works, and so you don't go and seek, right?
Yeah.
Because spatially, it's also quite difficult. The place that you would go and find somebody who's very different to you is perhaps quite far, or it's inaccessible, or there are all these things at play. So when I moved to Johannesburg, and access to different kinds of people and different realities it was matter of fact. There was no way it wasn't going to happen. And I built a life and I created a life in Johannesburg, and in some ways, organically, that kind of difference entered my space, and me as being somebody who's different to other people, I entered their space. And I realized there's a lot to be done here. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I just said, you know what, this is important to me. It means something to me, so I have to do it. And then, of course, on the other hand, I had made a decision that I want to be a researcher and a writer and an author. I had then decided what kind of things I want to write about, which is the stuff that I write about today. And so in doing that, I was very intentional also then about going to find the skill set and the resources academically to do that, because I knew that in the space, for me to, I can do it. I can come out and I can just talk and be like, this is wrong, that's what needs to be done. But I know because of the positionality that I hold, being colored, being queer, I'm going to be invalidated by the powers that be.
Constantly.
So I decided, you know what? I like education, I like learning, I like doing all of those things. So let me actually get a formal qualification to just nip that invalidation in the bud.
Yes.
And so it was a combination of those things, but that's ultimately how it came about.
And yeah, I mean, in the conversations that we've had, you know, in the past as well, having to, every single time you have conversations in the public space, you've mentioned that you keep being invalidated. There's moments of invalidation.
Yeah.
But does it not sometimes stem from, and it's something that Maite Zabala Alde said when we had a live together, as people of color, we have to check our own internal biases because we've been okay with far too much. And we also, our own internal, personal, unconscious biases, sometimes even conscious biases, allow certain things to happen within our space that should not be happening.
Yeah. So you know what? There are reasons for that, right? So it reminds me of, there's a very famous and old American scholar and theorist called W.E.B. Du Bois. And the Americans say Du Bois.
Du Bois.
But, yes. But so Du Bois put forward this concept of double consciousness. And it's basically, and of course we're speaking in the context of the Black American in the States, but it's applicable elsewhere. And the concept is this: you develop this double consciousness because as a Black person you operate in a white supremacist world, and so for your own survival it's important for you to learn the ways of white supremacy and white supremacist society in order for you to have what he then calls a second sight. And that is to be able to see a thing before it's coming. So you are trained to, for your own survival, to look at the world around you, be able to make calculations about what might come your way and how you need to behave in order not to be met with violence. Of course, that's a futile exercise, right? Because you're going to be met with violence anyway. But you're going to try. You're going to try. But then what happens is, I think in that process of now learning those ways and trying to protect yourself, it does settle somewhere in your consciousness that this is actually how the world works and how it should work, right? So there's that. The other part of it is, of course, somebody said, was quoting someone else, but it was Dr. Melusi Dlamini, and he was saying that our activism often ends where our oppression stops, right? And so when it's something that doesn't personally affect you, you don't tend to be as invested in dismantling it as something that would personally affect you, right? And I don't know.
As we see with gender-based violence versus violence against queer bodies.
It's unfortunate, right? Because the truth is, you are but
and that's gender-based violence in itself. But to your point.
But you are on a spectrum, right? Because there's this particular group that's being targeted and violence is being meted out to them. It doesn't affect you now, but it's coming. Because once the powers that be are done with that group, you are next in line. And so that's why a politics of solidarity is so important for us to see how we are all connected and how our struggles are all connected. But also just to realize that, yes, you have been taught certain things about people. You have been taught certain things about people's differences, because that's the other thing. These things don't have meaning until we attach meaning to it, right? But when you look at another person and you do not see a reflection of yourself, there is something fundamentally amiss with your humanity. And of course, again, because we've been socialized into these violent systems, we cannot fool ourselves into thinking that our humanity has not been touched by that. And we have to interrogate where we are on that spectrum.
Yeah.
Because it is not just that because you are oppressed, you are the pinnacle of humanity. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
You see? All these influences work together to impact on you and change how you operate in the world. And so, for me, I think the most important thing, it sounds extremely simple, but it's actually quite complicated.
Yeah.
But to realize that when you see another human being in front of you, there should be a reflection of yourself standing back at you. And if not, then you have to ask serious questions about your own humanity. Where has it gone?
Yeah. I want to take you back to the book Hammer, where you speak about the new neighbors that moved into the neighborhood, the Xhosa family that moved into the neighborhood. What then did you not know that you kind of know now? And had it been the adult, this body, Jamil there, what kind of diagnosis would you have made of what was going on then in those moments? Because I've been the Xhosa and the colored, with the colored family and the Xhosa family, and us visiting the colored family and sometimes visiting the Xhosa family, and kind of like, I fit into both. Why must we live separate kind of lives and kind of code switch every time we move between houses?
So I don't necessarily think that I knew less then than I know now. I might not have had a vocabulary to articulate it. But I think what I was at the time was disempowered, right? So I speak very clearly in the book about that incident. And I mean, for those who haven't read the book yet, it's basically...
Please read the book.
It's basically a Xhosa family moved into our neighborhood, for all intents and purposes, exclusively colored neighborhood up until that point. And there were...
Bernardino Heights.
Yes. There were neighbors who were, I think it was like, 5 o'clock kind of, so people were coming home from work, and so catching up and chatting, and the neighbors were chatting to, so colored neighbors were chatting to each other, and they were talking about the new family that had moved in. And to describe the wife or the mom of the family, they used the K word, but ever so affectionately, and I know it sounds absolutely bizarre as to how this could be said affectionately, right? But it's almost as if, and by no means do I believe that the person didn't know that that was an absolutely unacceptable word to use, but it was so deeply ingrained in her vocabulary that she had managed to find a way to use it in a very everyday sense, to just describe a person. Because in her mind, well, what else am I supposed to call the person, And that is how deeply ingrained the effects of racial violence is in this country, that it can get to a point where you use such a derogatory slur and you can turn around and say, but I meant well. It's absolutely unbelievable. So that was the incident. And I heard this, I was playing in the road with friends, and the adults, they talk around you. And I heard this as I was playing, and immediately I just, it's like, I don't know, that feeling where you've lost something and you realize it's gone, and that warm, sinking feeling comes over you like, oh God, I'm in trouble now, And I remember stopping to then actually turn and look at this conversation that was happening, and also just to check, like, did that actually just happen, But I was a child, and I knew for a fact that if I were to say something about it, either I would be dismissed or I would be reprimanded. Because you don't check adults, you don't interrupt them, you don't do any of those
What are you
things.
doing listening to adults' conversations anyway?
Exactly. And so the reaction that I would have today to that, had I had the power to do it then, I think would have been exactly the same. Because I grew up around this kind of anti-blackness all my life, right? But at no point, and I think about it often and I wonder how it happened, but I think this just comes down to actually, again, humanity.
Yeah.
It's been around me all my life. I always knew that it was wrong. I always knew that it was harmful. I always knew that the people whom this is being directed at are being hurt by this thing.
Yeah.
And therefore it shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
You know. So there's, there's that. So that's not necessarily participating in it was never something that I subscribe to. But I can tell you this, even so, it is not as if it didn't settle somewhere in my consciousness.
Yeah.
Because you see the effects of those words and those terms, right? And you can very neatly line it up to the social consequences for the people that are being harmed by that word, right?
Yeah.
So you look at your life, you look at the people who are being harmed, and you see the differences. And you can actually tell it's because the world views you in this way that your life looks the way it does.
Because, I mean, I'm light-skinned. I was better received at my colored family's home.
Yes.
You know, it was, oh, you know, she's so cute.
Yes.
But if only your hair was a little bit curlier.
Exactly.
And then my darker-skinned cousin was, oh, unomnyamazana. You know, oh, the black one. So, look, we have different lives.
Absolutely.
And you can see the consequences of those things and those words, how they've built up or broken down. You know, us as the darker her, the lighter skinned me.
Yeah. And of course, this comes back to the thing that I said earlier about these words are simply just words until we give it a meaning. And once we give it a meaning, it starts having social consequences for people. Because you do not, for example, attach prosperity and dignity and abundance to somebody who in your mind is but a slur. That's all there is to them. They're a slur. And for that reason, their lives need to look a certain way and cannot look the way yours does, because you are deserving of more simply because you don't fit that profile.
Sure.
Yeah.
And, you know, same setting, Bernardino Heights in Cape Town. You speak about you didn't subscribe and didn't believe in the singularity of coloredness, of colored persons.
Yes.
Can you break that down for us and help us understand what that means? Because South Africans seem to have a belief that there is one coloredness.
Yeah. I can see how that comes about, right? That was a part of a very deliberate project by apartheid also. Because the category was also created as a sort of like catch-all kind of for the people we don't know what to do with, that's them. But even in our community, literally like between the houses. Of course, the context here is also Cape Town. There are also different Cape Towns. So I grew up in the northern suburbs of Cape Town, which is a very, very different sort of ethnic and even religious makeup to what would be the southern suburbs. And so even there was a kind of othering, right? So now you're on the other side of what they call the Boerewors curtain, which is the
track lines.
But it's also a reference to where white Afrikaner hegemony sort of operates, and that's more in the north. So it's closer to Durbanville, to Stellenbosch, to those kind of strongholds of that white Afrikaner nationalism, right? That is not necessarily the case in the south. In the south, you'll find more English hegemony operating there. But within that very community, right, even between neighbors, you could tell. Also, the thing is, people came from different places to settle there, right? And now we have to be one community. But at least the binding thing was this coloredness, right? But the differences between us were stark. They were stark in terms of religion and inside religion in many ways. I can't say for all people, but for colored people, a lot of times also are linked to sort of cultural practices, right? So in some ways, you don't even know, is this religion or is this culture? Because it becomes so intertwined. But So the differences were stark between us because of the fact that people came from different places, and they also had kind of different different ethnic backgrounds.
Yeah, so some would be more Malay.
Yes,
some
yes,
more
yes.
Indian.
Yes, yeah. But for the most part, because we're all sort of from Cape Town in a sense, there's a sense of, yeah, okay, cool, we're all the same.
Yeah.
But then you move out of Cape Town, and then it's like I came to Joburg, for example, and here I met a lot of people who then would also identify themselves as colored, but come from elsewhere in the country, right? And then you're standing in front of the person, and maybe the only thing that you have in common is maybe the language that you speak. And then you don't even speak it in the same way either. The accent differences and sort of vocabulary differences. And then I started realizing, growing up, I thought, and it's a part of that project, but I thought that we're all the same all across the country. Everybody in the country who's colored is the same as people who are in Cape Town.
Yes. And I think there's also it's like an unsaid thing where colored people in Cape Town think that all colored people all over came from.
Yeah. Because it is a big part of the origin story, right?
Yeah.
But that's not where the story ends, and that's the problem, right? And of course, the other thing is that people form different kinds of subjectivities and identities because of the physical environments that they find themselves in. So coastal identities look different to inland identities. The proximity, for example, of colored people in the Northern Cape to indigenous people in those parts, that influences the way they move through the world and their languages and the way. So for all intents and purposes, we might all speak Afrikaans, right?
Yeah.
But the influences of those different places have shaped a different kind of language throughout. And so moving through that, and then also coming to terms with the fact that meeting different people, the fact that people in other parts of the country, colored people in other parts of the country, take great exception to being lumped in with this idea of everybody's from Cape Town and being related to as if they are. And then, of course, because you get asked questions, right, and then you can't answer because that's not your cultural background, right? And it's being asked you very matter-of-factly, do you know that thing that, and they're like, no, I don't. And then it seems like, but what kind of person, what kind of colored person are you? Realizing that has also propelled a lot of the work that I do. So my research is on colored identities, but a big part of that is actually pulling apart this idea of coloredness as a monolith. Because it's important. People deserve to be recognized and seen in their fullness, which is not necessarily the same as yours. So, but this idea also makes the idea of coloredness very complicated then, because for a lot of cultural groupings or ethnic groupings or racial groupings, the thing that makes you belong to this group is that you are the same as the next person who identifies. And I tend to ask the question, is sameness or even similarity the main criteria for group identification? Could it possibly be that the reason why different kinds of people would identify as colored, right, would actually be rooted in the ways that they are different? Also thinking about the idea that there is, however, for the way I think about it, there is a sense of overlapping histories. There are historical trajectories that people have come through. And there are big overlaps between those things. And I think that is how we come to this idea of colored and coloredness. But to turn it into this one-dimensional thing is a disservice to the very people who you are trying to describe. And it makes me think of a quote that I came across by James Baldwin. And of course, again, he was talking about the Black American context. But it goes something like, could it be that actually what binds all black people of the world is actually just a history of oppression? And he says, and that for some or other reason, some left Africa and others stayed. And I find that in relation to the idea of coloredness, I find that a very, very useful concept to work with is that maybe the thing that makes us all the same is this shared history of oppression, a particular kind of oppression, right, that maybe other groups in South Africa have not experienced or that did not exclusively experience.
But that in itself is, you know, I think a lot of ethnic groups dig deep enough. I claim being Xhosa, but in actual fact, I could be classified as colored if I dig deep enough. And come and realize that shared, you know, that shared trauma, that shared background. And when we actually dig deeper into the meaning of what being colored is, your trauma would reveal that you're much more colored than you're actually Xhosa, but you identify as Xhosa because we have this notion that colored are the others.
And I mean, it's in some ways also, look, a lot of, because of trying to escape persecution, because of the way the political makeup of apartheid worked, right? There are a lot of people who changed their surnames, who, you know, sort of moved into neighborhoods that eventually they could assimilate into. You know, there's, and also just even like way back. When we're talking about indigenous people, like the San people, who some assimilated into the Zulu kingdom. To escape persecution, because there was a time when indigenous people in this country were hunted like animals. Colonizers could obtain permits to hunt them. And to escape that, they were assimilated into so groups. Today, that person, the descendants of that person would understand themselves simply as Zulu. But if they go back into the history, perhaps, if that was not the case, the descendants of those original San people who assimilated might not have been Zulu, because they didn't assimilate into the kingdom, right?
So when it comes to blackness and religion, and somebody that has dealt with so much oppression and violence in these intersections of blackness and religion, what are some of the things that you've identified along the way? Because rooted in our blackness is a lot of religion, but rooted in it is oppression. That's what it was made for, right? Black people must be religious in order to move forward with the agenda of oppression. Now, as a queer man yourself, or a queer body yourself, because I don't think queer man is the right language.
Can I?
Will you correct me there? You will correct me.
Don't call me
in your answer. You'll correct me in your answer. Because I want to be able to understand the language and understand why I'm wrong in saying that. What are some things that you identified along the way, and how we need to fix ourselves in the process of moving forward?
So the first point is that I don't identify as a man. I'm a non-binary person, and so it's simply okay to just refer to me as a queer person. So religion is a very complicated one, right? We know the ways in which particularly Christianity has been used as a tool to colonize. We know that. Christianity, however, historically was not solely the property of white supremacy. It was in many ways co-opted, the way a lot of things were co-opted by white supremacy, right? In many ways today, the format and the way in which religion is practiced is oppressive. The teachings are oppressive. The way in which churches specifically require of their congregants to conduct themselves endorses the idea of oppressing others who are not like them.
Dress this way, look this way. This is what, the pastor says, you must do this, you must cover your shoulders.
And you ask yourself, why? Why would you continue? Why do you go on? Also, I mean, you find people who are in that setting, and while they are in it, they would admit that it's hard and it's hurtful and it you know, it doesn't sit right with them, but they continue. And you see, I think there is a sense of weird protection that one can derive from associating with an institution that, for all intents and purposes, is still normative, right? So, for example, in a church, as a woman, you would find yourself to be oppressed and dismissed and not fully acknowledged. That's one part of the context. However, when you walk out into the world, being known as a woman of God or a woman of the church, that has a different meaning for you, for how you relate to other people. Now it describes a sense of importance to you. And so people have to make these trade-offs, right? But with that said, I also want to point out that we must not strip people of their agency also to use the institutions as systems of healing for themselves. I mean, we know the oppressive nature of religious structures, right? But then we also know the church mothers who do such wonderful work in their communities through the church, with the church. Also, going to a religious gathering is also a form of community, community building.
Also, I think from the stories of our own history of not being allowed to practice, have our own religious practice, not religious, cultural practices, church and religion became where we leaned on.
You didn't have that many choices, you know. And of course, today, I mean, these things evolve and some things change and some things don't. But I also know many people who don't necessarily feel so deeply invested in what's going on at church, but they go because they can be with their friends. There's also that, you know. So it's complex, and it is. This is the thing about life, right? Contradiction galore. It's never either or. It's both and, you know, and that's okay. I think where the buck stops is when you participate in things that harm others. Simply that. And that's the thing that needs to be interrogated. I'm not going to sit and say, stop going to church, stop doing this, it's all oppressive. I understand why people do that, but I think what I would say is that we need to interrogate how the systems that we participate in, be they religion, be they cultural, be they, you know, whatever they are, we need to understand that when we participate in these systems, how are we perpetuating harm? And those are the things that need to stop immediately. There's no kind of, you can figure it out as you go along as to how you got there and how it makes you feel and all of these things, but the harm has to stop immediately.
In one of your recent opinion pieces, you talk about the dysfunction of our Rainbow Nation, and I want to quote you. A social engineering project aimed at soothing white anxieties about being cleansed from the stolen land they have occupied for centuries. And in relation to black people, what role are we playing in this particular dysfunction of this Rainbow Nation?
Yeah, you know, we were duped.
From the get-go.
is the simple answer, right? The promise of, so there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I maintain was a beautiful idea in theory, if it was properly implemented, right? But of course, politics had already entered the door before the commission could even take its course. If you think about it outside of the context of South Africa, that setup of relating to other human beings, yes, they've harmed you immensely, but then relating to other human beings and getting through that and finding the humanity in the situation, amazing concept. But the point about it was no accountability. And mind you, there were recommendations for what must happen, but that was never followed through on. So when we then move from there to the Rainbow Nation, so now that's done, we've healed, we've spoken out our things. There was, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a wonderful idea in theory. If you think about being faced with, with another person, yes, they have harmed you tremendously, but you are facing this person to try and find some kind of common humanity from which you can move forward. But the issue was there was no accountability.
Yeah.
It was not followed through on. And mind you, there were recommendations. There were recommendations that were made for now that we've done this, and now that we've found out what we found out, what must happen now? But that was never implemented, right? So now you have people who are sitting still harmed, because that doesn't go away. Just because you and I had a chat doesn't mean that I wasn't harmed.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't go away, but now also you don't feel like justice was served. You don't feel like any accountability was brought. And it also sort of encouraged those who were not necessarily physically sitting in that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but participated in that harm. It taught them, oh, but then I can just get away with it.
You're just going to get a little smack on the wrist and get it moving.
The rules don't apply to me.
Yeah.
And so from there, we then transition into this idea of the Rainbow Nation, which again, poetically, very beautiful idea. But the idea is now that because we've come through this, we are now all the... Yes, we're different, but we are the same in our South Africanness, and we're going to share this land, and we are going to, you know, everything is just going to be great. Now, systemic barriers that were put in place before this happened still exist.
Yeah.
Now it's maybe not illegal, or it's not criminalized.
I almost want to cry as you're talking, because I'm just like, this is like, there's no movement, Mas.
Yeah.
I'm just happen to be here sitting with you now
Yes.
in our white neighborhood.
Yes. And it's 27 years into democracy, we still
Yeah.
refer to it as a white neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the fact that we now live in these neighborhoods
Yeah.
doesn't change the fact that
Doesn't
that's what
change
it
that it's
is,
not.
right?
Yeah.
Because now we don't have the apartheid police knocking the door down anymore. We have the
What are
neighborhood
you doing
watch.
here? Yes.
We have the neighborhood
Well,
watch.
yeah.
There's a suspicious car that's been standing here. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
it's like the owner of the house who needed a break.
Talking about that, I think let's step into then the next question.
Yeah.
Breaking down the dichotomy of just our blackness.
Yeah.
With all the events that are happening around the world, with, is it Lindani Nieni?
Yeah. Yeah.
Breonna Taylor.
Yeah.
The recent ruling on remind me of the name again.
George Floyd.
George Floyd.
Yes.
Murderers getting convicted for murder. Like, I'm laughing because legit,
Yeah.
a murderer being convicted of murder, and we clapped.
Yeah. Yeah.
We clapped. We're like, woohoo! We celebrated.
Yeah.
How bad is it? Like, how bad is it?
We say, okay, and also that's a specific context, right? It's important,
No,
and
I mean, it's a specific context, but still in South Africa, even though it's not a white cop, but
Yes,
there's
no,
still
sure.
a cop
Yes,
shooting a black body.
Yeah.
And then asking a white woman, ma'am, are you okay?
Yeah. Look, I mean, this is the point, right? So in the United States specifically, we know that white supremacy has a particular face in that country, and that face sits in the White Office, and the White House still,
Yes.
the Oval Office. And so, in some ways, it's like, it makes sense because you can connect white supremacy with a white face. There's a very clear linear link between the two. And then in some ways you get to implement that double consciousness and that second sight, right? Where you can see it coming. South Africa, we very, I don't know if it was unexpected, maybe to some it was, but we managed to change the face of what oppression looks like to look like us. And again, that was a part of a deliberate system that made it so, right? To sort of allay people's anxieties and to sort of lull them into a false sense of security, right? And then over time, the work that needs to be done doesn't get done. And then you realize, wow, you're actually doing the same thing. But now you look like me, right? And now I think there's been a long time of coming to terms with what that actually means, right? Because for many people, the end of apartheid was supposed to be the end.
Yes.
All right? And it didn't happen that way. Now, not only do you have to contend with the fact that it didn't end, you also have to contend with your own feelings and sort of anxieties about how you didn't see it coming, how you didn't expect it. Now you're also mourning the death of this dream that you had in your mind, right? And I think that leads to a level of sort of inertia in, like, you step back and you just like, I don't know what's going on, I can't believe this, right? But with that said, I mean, we have been resisting. I think we were having this conversation in the makeup room, talking about how do you expect of people to be sort of, especially in the context where they were promised something else. I think during apartheid, it wasn't promised to you that you're going to have a good life. It was told to you in your face.
We were actually told.
Yeah. But you are still living the same way that you did. In some cases maybe worse. And so where do you find the energy and the time to be doing physical demonstrations and calling out and holding people accountable when you're actually just trying to feed your family and stay alive, right? But with that said, I mean, I think we have enough of our own examples in South Africa to name. But this is the thing, right, about we changed the faces and the people who are in the positions of power, but we didn't change the system. So now basically the police force. The police force in America was evolved out of slave patrols. That system didn't change. The evidence is in the way that it operates today.
Something else.
What was the purpose of the police in South Africa? Basically the same thing, but the system was not reformed. Now you take black people who are the descendants of enslaved people the world over, and you put them in charge of a system that was meant to annihilate them. And you also take disempowered people they're disempowered in other aspects of their lives, and you give them this marginal sense of power, while also instructing them to uphold a system of white supremacy. Where are we going to get with that? You know, and so that's why the same kind of police brutality that we see today.
Do you think we play into the system of white supremacy when, in the sense that our government has to kind of adhere to global standards? Global this, how we're attracting investors, and we hear it every day. Are those the kinds of systems that we uphold? But it's supremacy that we're standing. You know, they're kind of standing in front of black-facing supremacy.
I mean, that's a very, very interesting point to make, right? Because the idea of investors invest because they sort of, the place that they're investing in is committed to making conditions favorable for them.
But also, there's also the other side of things. Investors, when an investor invests, they're also investing in the people. So it's
We'd hope so.
Like it's also kind of
but which people? Who are the people that they are investing in is the question. So South Africa, so I have a very big problem with this idea of South Africa. South Africa is a myth. The concept of South Africa is a myth. Even when we talk about South Africans, a lot of the time when people say South Africans, they're referring to different kinds of black South Africans, right? But when you think about how the idea of South Africa must be applied to include everyone, South Africa is still very much a white supremacist settler colony. And so when investors, and most of the time, you see, investors themselves are, I don't know, the Europeans or the white Americans. So when investors invest, they are investing in the stability of the idea of South Africa as a white supremacist settler colony. And that colony has the interests of 1% of that country at all in mind. The other people that fall outside of that 1%, again, linked to the history of South Africa, those people are labor. Labor to make the investment work, but it's not for their benefit, right? And so when we, as a government or a state, when we face the world, in order to receive that investment, we have to reassure them that we are going to participate in upholding that system. So you have the 1% that whose physical lives are being invested in, right? And those physical lives have consequences for everybody else's lives.
Yeah.
And then the other 99%, those are the workers.
Yeah.
And that's how it has worked since time immemorial. Slavery, colonization, apartheid, those systems just evolve to look a little bit different as time goes by, changing with the times, you know.
But in actual fact, it still is.
Yeah. So, so when we talk about how can this happen here? Because this is not, you know,
we're 80% black.
How can this happen here? Is because, yes, might be 80% black, but white supremacy is not the exclusive property of white people and whiteness. We participate in that system as well. And this country's sort of democratic government has been invested in it for a long time. So, so this government is extremely invested in white supremacy. The system that was inherited, right? In some ways, there was kind of like a promise made to uphold that system in exchange for the governance of that system, right? So when our leaders will sit on TV and talk pro-blackness and anti-white supremacy and all of this, and then 3 weeks later you find out that that very individual who sat there and said that is deep in business with with Broederbond people, Stellenbosch mafia, right? So you ask yourself, how does that happen? Because the system never changed, and the agreement was, we will give you this sort of aesthetic makeover if the system can remain in place. And we see the evidence for it all around us. We're still talking about white areas. We're still talking about white spaces. And it shouldn't be happening. And it's also a kind of an uncomfortable thing to say, that you would identify a space as white. But the reason why you do that is because you look at it and you see it.
Once again, we put meaning to words.
Yes.
Once again, we put meaning to words.
So
we say it,
but
you know, it's the meaning behind it that we sometimes forget, that it is white spaces.
And these things settle in our consciousness, you know. It doesn't just go away. This is the thing that I also want, like I think that very opinion piece that you're talking about. Another thing that I said in that thing was, so 1994 comes along, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Rainbow Nation, and now everything is healed. Where do we think the racism went? How did it supposedly just disappear? That stuff doesn't just leave you.
It doesn't.
You know?
But where to from here? How do you think there's any solve in our generation?
There's a promise. There is a promise. I think more and more with each passing day, consciousness is rising, it's increasing. And again, I'm under no illusion that it was always there. I just think in some ways we didn't expect to have to do it again. You know, but I'm quite inspired by the younger generation. I mean, my generation is doing great things, but even the generation after us, I'm inspired. I mean, there's really no time, no room for nonsense. Like the things that I'm talking about that settled in our consciousness, the younger generation is like, for what? No, why I'm not doing this? You know, so there's that. But you know, I want to again quote James Baldwin, who was asked about, and he was asked about the stuff in the 60s. This is the other thing that really blows my mind. This conversation can be transplanted into the 1960s and still be relevant, which is unbelievable. But nevertheless, he was asked about it, about sort of hope and what do you see happening? And he said, I have to be an optimist I have to be an optimist, because if I am not, then I have decided that being human is an academic matter.
Sure.
And
Do you find being human an academic matter?
No, not at all. You know, it's. I must be honest. I do sometimes like slip into hopelessness and pessimism. But when I think,
I know when I talk to you, sometimes it's just
Yeah.
like, nee, fuck, man.
yeah, like what? How? Why?
Yeah.
But I think that statement kind of pulls me back, because it's a very profound thing to say. You cannot take humanity and the human condition and the you know the world in which humans exist and make it purely an academic matter, because we are so much more than just A plus B equals C, you know. And it's
I found myself in that space quite a lot,
Yeah.
where, my work career life was basically, I had to wake up every morning and push myself to work, but I knew that majority of the black people where I work are literally, it's the executives, it's the management, and then there's us,
yeah
you know? So it was, you know what, I'm just another black body that is being looted for their labor, for them to earn.
yeah
I had to snap out of that,
yeah
and that was work.
yeah. And you know, the thing that Baldwin says is also something that our mothers used to say, kind of, you know, just for holding on to that glimmer of hope. And there's another scholar by the name of Chiru who refers to it as subversive hope. So this idea of staying hopeful as resistance to the system that wants to knock it out of you, right? And for some people, it's actually all you have. Everything around you spells death and destruction.
Yeah.
But in a situation like that, to not hand yourself over to despair, right? There is a sense of resistance in that, to say that, yes, I know nothing around me looks like it would ever get better, but I'm still going to try, I'm still going to hope. When I say that, I also want to add that I don't want to take that statement and make it like, well, this is a standard, and so those people who don't do that, they just like, you know, they should be discarded. It's also very valid to go, I give up.
Yeah.
Because it's relentless. It's absolutely relentless. It doesn't matter which way you turn, something is always saying to you, give up, right? And so for some people, they do. And that, for me, is not a statement about those people. I really don't like the idea of when we talk about human beings, oh, they're so resilient. Why do they have to be resilient against things?
Against what?
What we really need to be interrogating when we talk about people who have hope and who are resilient, why does it have to be so difficult? Why is the world that we have created so harsh and so harmful that the only thing that people can derive some kind of joy out of is this idea that I'm just holding on for a little bit longer?
Sure. Yeah. I think in closing, after all is said and done, is there still hope from Jamil's perspective?
There is. It's difficult to find it sometimes. It's really hard to explain why one should be hopeful. And I sympathize with those who would be like, I don't buy it, I don't get it. But for me, I think, you know, I thought this is part of what I said in my acceptance speech for the HSS award. I said, it was always my goal with this work to create an archive of lives and experiences that, due to the unfortunate political circumstances of this country, were buried alive. And so a part of doing that, right? So now I know that what I'm saying is not necessarily the first time that somebody's heard this. The lives that I'm now talking about have been lived before. So when I do that, when I sort of want to create this archive because other experiences and records were destroyed and buried alive, like I say, it is with a certain level of hope that I do that, because I have seen what happened before and I'm trying to do it again. So the possibility that that could be buried again is there, right? And so if you see that in your sort of in your forecast for this, you could easily go like, well, if that's how it's going to end again, I'm not doing this, right? But so I continue, because even if it's only just for this moment, that somebody else reads something that I say or hears something that I say, and in that moment, for the first time in their lives, they feel seen and validated and heard, then it's worth it. It's worth it for me. And that's the kind of hope that drives me to keep on doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for always just being the well of which we come and we draw inspiration and education when it comes to conversations with regard to critical diversity conversations, as well as just digging deeper in ourselves, holding mirrors up in front of ourselves, and also finding the right language on how to face or deal with and address certain issues and conversations. And thank you for never backing down in telling us that we need to go back and do the work and then come forward and ask the questions. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Go get the books, Khamr, The Makings of a Waterslam. You can find it on jacana.co.za. Get yourselves that book. It is filled with so much goodness. I was educated. I also learned and stepped into the life of Jamil in this particular autobiography. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Sit Down Relationships. Until next time.